Everybody, thanks so much for listening to the podcast. If you're listening to us on one of the podcasting sites, we thank you so much. If you're listening to us on the YouTube, please like, subscribe, or share this interview. This is Daniel Levin. The book is Proof of Life. Definitely check it out in bookstores now. Daniel, my question is, obviously the COVID crisis has been going on for quite a while. We have saw the US, Europe, Israel, and also a couple other countries limit travel to a few African countries right now due to the Omicron coming out of South Africa. My thing with that is I think it's kind of foolish. The Omicron is traveled all over the world right now. It's in the US, it's all over the world in general, limiting travel. And the thing that gets me, and you can clarify this too, is when they say they're limiting travel, it's US citizens can still go to these places from what I'm told, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but the people from that country cannot come to the US. But I know Israel is involved in this too. They just cut off 10 countries that they're limiting travel to. Do you think this is even a good idea, whether it's Israel, the US, or Europe in general?
Well, first of all, the idea that you would go after sub-Saharan Africa just when you think there's a strain coming from there, which makes no sense. And the colonial sort of legacy and the racism of that is so obvious. I don't even want to waste my breath on that stuff. Now, secondly, when it comes to pandemic response, the only way you deal with this is with a global vaccine campaign as quickly as possible, because the only thing that you can't stop the travel, you can't stop germs from traveling anymore. That's simply, that ship has sailed. The one thing you can do, you need to have global vaccine campaigns. It so happens that Omicron, basically the only vaccines that are effective against it are the two mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna, or right. The other ones really are ineffective, whether it's AstraZeneca or any of the Chinese vaccines, the Russian vaccines, which are all copies of other ones. The Indian vaccine, which is a copy of AstraZeneca, manufactured there. The J&J one is not effective. Plus, you have the blood clot issue there. So it's really the two mRNA ones. What really needs to happen is basically like a War Powers Act, where you kick industrial production into vaccine manufacturing and mass vaccines all over the world, and you stop the disinformation campaign. And I mean really stop it. You have to have vaccine mandates. It's just become such a stupid tribal political issue. It's off the charts, not only in the US, all over the world, right? The idea, what's next? We're going to debate whether people need to stop at red lights or wear seatbelts or not. There are laws that are done for global safety. Right. And the idea that a vaccine mandate violates your liberty has become so stupid. This is a pandemic. It's not going to stop mutating if you can't vaccinate a large segment of the world's population. It's just not going to happen. You can do all the travel bans you want. It's just not going to happen. You need vaccine mandates, and you need mask mandates. Whether they're voluntary or mandated by government is not my main issue. Now, I think this can be done. We are now on the precipice of this becoming endemic. There's a good chance that this pandemic becomes endemic in the course of 2022. And already Omicron is starting to show signs that it's less fatal and simply that contagious. It really does look more and more like a cold kind of virus. But the data is not as clear. It's very likely that the positivity rate is exponentially higher than what we want, right? When they talk about 98,000 positive cases in the UK a day right now, they think that the real number is close to 250,000. If that's true, what that really means is the fatality rate's actually much, much smaller in percentage than what we assumed, right? So, the next step really is to stop the politicizing. I think you want to get global media companies on board. You got to talk to Fox, you talk to others and say, listen, we got to be in this together. I know you have freedom of expression, you have free journalism, you can say whatever you want. But there comes a moment where the disinformation, where you can't have anchors talk against vaccines when they themselves got vaccinated and their families got vaccinated. You just really shouldn't have it. I'm not having now a political discussion, and I don't care if you're right or left. And it exists on the right fringe and exists on the left fringe, right? This is just about the fact. Now, again, you asked me about China earlier. You can't do this without China. The Chinese have closed their borders, right? They're not allowing travel in and out. The Chinese can't leave without coming back and having 4 weeks quarantine, and you can't go to China without 4 weeks quarantine. Now, They thought they can weather this pandemic with their own vaccine. They've vaccinated their population with Chinese vaccines, right? The only problem is Omicron, you already have it in China, and Omicron is totally unaffected by Chinese vaccines. So the Chinese too have realized they need to start cooperating. They need to import mRNA vaccines too. So this is a moment where the world really has to come together and start to have a coherent strategy. If you don't vaccinate, whatever, 400 million Indonesians, right? 250 million Nigerians. If you don't do that, and that's the next mutation, it doesn't matter how good your life is in the US. It's just going to keep on mutating and mutating. And listen, it can become deadly. It can become a smallpox kind of thing. We haven't even witnessed a really deadly plague yet with this coronavirus here, like in proportions that are really scary. So this is now the moment to really get together on that.
Well, it's a lot of this, and I know some people will hate to agree with this, and maybe you don't agree, but I blame this somewhat on President Biden. He is the president of the United States. It's came out in the Hill newspaper and the New York Times. Kamala Harris said that the administration was flat-footed on Omicron. I think that's a joke. They have all the information they need as far as that goes. And second of all, like you said, they will not, these mRNA the vaccines were done by government money. Government research was put in to these vaccines, especially Moderna. And with that, they should be releasing these patents to other countries. It's big pharma greed that is running this pandemic and keep pushing it. So then we have people that are saying, well, I got 2 shots. Now I got to get a 3rd shot. Now I got to get a 4th shot. And they think that it's a joke. But again, the big pharma companies don't want to release these patents to the rest of the world, like you said, and cut the pandemic in half or altogether. And these people are dying overseas. And like you said, it'll just keep happening because these countries don't have the money to get a vaccine, whether it's in Africa or Asia or whatever it may be. And the rest of the world is screwed because of it.
Let me ask you a question, because I kind of disagree with you. I want to know what in your mind do you think President Biden should have done differently? Because when you talk about big pharma, it's not really a presidential issue. So what is it you think he should have done that he didn't do properly as compared to, let's say, the prior administration?
But my thing is, Daniel, well, I'm not, maybe Trump had power over this too, because it was the Trump vaccine. He did do all those, the Operation Warp Speed. But my thing is, again, this is government research. We put tax dollars into this research as people, as citizens of the United States. So with that, why is Biden, or even if Trump was president, why are they not going to these companies and saying, you did this, you made these vaccines with government funding. You need to release the patents to these other countries so they can make vaccine and give it to their own people. They shouldn't be dependent on the U.S. in the COVAX program, sending it to all these countries overseas.
So a number of points to unpack here. First of all,
yeah, go ahead.
First of all, it's not that this was just government funded. There was government support for these vaccine developments, right. But certainly, and by the way, the Pfizer vaccine is a German vaccine, BioNTech. And so there's support, there's subsidies, but the bulk of the vaccine development came from private sector funding, number one, the bulk, right? So that's number one. Second of all, a government can't just go to a pharma company. I'm not defending big pharma. That's a subject for another day, but you can't just go and say you need to make it widely available, because that would be unconstitutional, but would essentially come to a taking. What we call a taking would be an expropriation. You can't just say to someone, the IP, your intellectual property, you have to now make it publicly available. Now, if you wanted to do that, right, then the only way for that to happen with proper compensation is not through presidential decree, through Congress. And this is where you're done, because the entire Congress is being so heavily lobbied and supported by big pharma. So just forget that. That's like financial regulation. It's just not going to happen. That ship has sailed in the US. If you wanted that to happen, that ship sailed with a court case of Citizens United, where unlimited funding goes into politics. So we don't even need to debate that anymore. And anybody who thinks that it's a First Amendment right to have unlimited funding in politics, because otherwise it's an infringement on free speech. If that's your position, that person can never, ever, ever complain about the issues like the one you just mentioned now, because that's why that's happening, okay? Since Citizens United, the ship has simply sailed. So Big Pharma can buy every single congressman and woman that's there and support their election and make it very clear to them if they don't protect Big Pharma, they're going to be out at the next election, right? So that's the reality that we're living in the United States today. So that's number one. Number three, you can have, the problem in many, many countries, for example, in African countries, is not that vaccines there. Do you know that in the Congo, in the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is in Central Africa, it's the size, it's like 6 times the size of Texas. It's bigger than Western Europe, okay? Do you know that in that country, they're throwing away vaccines, all kinds of vaccines, from J&J to Pfizer to Moderna. They're throwing them away because they're expiring, and there's such vaccine hesitancy because people do not trust government-administered vaccines, and because there's so much disinformation on social media, on websites, on certain news programs, certain anchors, including in the United States, that constantly poison people's minds about vaccines. Everything from thinking that it's a GPS chip of Bill Gates that's implanted in your shoulder, right? So if you allow for that kind of disinformation, you can mass manufacture vaccines until you blue in the face. People are not going to take it. So the effort here, we have the capacity to mass manufacture vaccines. Hundreds and hundreds of millions of dosages to vaccinate the world's population to get to herd immunity. The problem is not the profit margins of those vaccines. The problem is that people are not taking it and governments are refusing to make it mandatory.
I just wanted, while you were speaking, I did to look it up. So, you were definitely right about Pfizer. Moderna did get $2.5 billion to develop, and I'm just reading this right off the New York Times, $2.5 billion to help develop Moderna's vaccine and buy doses, according to the New York Times. So, I shouldn't have said Pfizer. I should have said
No,
just
Moderna did too, but Moderna also had private funds. All I'm saying is that there was definitely government subsidies, but there's plenty of private funds that goes into the vaccine development too. And the issue, and by the way, all the heads of the vaccine companies have offered up to make their vaccines available generically in the developing world, by the way. So it's not what's keeping it. But even if you wanted to compel that, it wouldn't be up to a president. It would really be up to Congress. And that's just not going to happen. Every time we talk about, for example, AIDS, antiviral drugs, right? That's not being generically made available in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's still in a region that's just people are dying of AIDS the whole time because the drug companies are just not willing to make that available generically. So it's not a new problem.
I want to end this topic on vaccines because I want to get your opinion on a lot of other stuff, and I know your time's valuable. But my thing is, with a lot of people, and I don't believe this, but a lot of people that I'm friendly with that are around my age or younger have this, the vaccine hesitancy, or they don't like the vaccine mandates. And the people on the left that I'm friends with that don't believe in the vaccine mandates are, again, and we go back to the big pharma money about, 1 shot, 2 shot, 3 shot, 4 shot. I know in Israel, they're looking at a 4th shot now, and people go, I got 3 shots in 1 year. How many is it going to take? And they're also worried about with these mandates and these vaccine cards, because we go back to this with the Patriot Act and the surveillance state that's already going on in the US, but also all over the world. And we've heard many reports about that. So people are seeing these vaccine mandates and saying we need a vaccine card, or you can't go into the restaurant if you vaccinated. And they're thinking about the Patriot Act on steroids. I'm not saying that I believe that. I'm just telling you from that point of view. What would you tell people that are worried about those things?
Listen, I think you're right. People are right to be worried about privacy. But my answer to those people is anyone who says they're worried about privacy, they better not have a smartphone. They better not use internet, right? Because you have a smartphone you ever use a GPS on your smartphone? I'm not even talking about social media where everything gets followed and tracked. I even just talk about using any phone. Your information's out there. Your least of your problems is a vaccine card. Believe me, that's the least of your problems. You're right. Since 9/11 and the Patriot Act, our privacy has been flushed down the toilet. Absolutely right. And you know what? People should read Edward Snowden's book if they want to learn more about that. irrespective of what you think of Edward Snowden's, understand the issue. Our privacy has been surrendered. But there should not be a single person who complains about that and is still on social media, uses smartphones, uses email, right? I mean, just stop, because that ship really has sailed. If you live like the Unabomber in a cabin without technology, then you can credibly make that claim. Chances are those people aren't vaccinated, but most people are complaining about it, are surrendering their privacy on a constant basis every day, number one. Number two, look, the whole issue of vaccine mandates and not, you shouldn't be forced, it's your body. It gets so silly. Many people who say it's my body, I get to decide what I want, are still pro-lifers, so they feel like a woman doesn't get to decide what she wants to do with her body. We live full of hypocrisies and contradictions. Let's take a step back and be reasonable. This is a pandemic. This is wiping out communities, okay? You have every day 9/11, which was a national calamity, and people lost so much, and you still remember the planes flying into the towers, okay? You have those amount of deaths dying pretty much every day right now because of this pandemic. So this is not some theoretical issue. It's not a flu. It's not a cold. This is really deadly, and it's wiping out people, devastating some communities more than others. We have a nation that's obese, and it's clearly hitting heavy and obese people more than others, beyond just the fact that you're diabetic or something else. There's something about this virus eating at fat cells. There's some feeding of fat cells too, right? So it's really devastating people. It's often devastating poor people. Now, if you're going to start saying the government doesn't get to tell me what to do, where do we stop? The government doesn't get to tell me whether to fasten my seatbelt. Okay, well, at least you're only killing yourself. What about the government doesn't get to tell me whether I need to stop at a stop sign or a red light? Now I'm suddenly killing other people. This is what the pandemic is, because by not vaccinating, by not wearing a mask, you're basically become a deadly weapon. Right? So do we still have the ability to look at it with common sense, with a little bit of empathy for our fellow citizens and for fellow people who live around us, neighbors, friends, family? Do we have that ability to say, you know what, we need to be in this together. We need to eradicate this thing. And yeah, there is a mandate. Yeah, there's a government that gets to tell me what to do something, but there's a higher good here. We don't live on an island. There's some context here, right? Educate yourself on the vaccines, understand what the vaccines are, do you know that mRNA vaccines were vaccines that were developed for cancer research? They weren't developed for vaccine. This is the new technology, messenger RNA, which is not a genetic manipulation. All those things are simply not true. Educate yourselves, understand what T cells are, understand what memory cells are. The more we understand, I'm not a vaccine advocate. Listen, I can tell you something. I didn't get the flu vaccine this winter. I didn't get it. And it turns out it's probably right not to get it. I'm not saying people shouldn't get it. I'm speaking only for myself. Why? Because the flu vaccine that you're taking now is based on a couple of strains of last year's flu season. Right? There's not a high likelihood that these are going to be the dominant strains this year. And in fact, it turns out the strains that the flu vaccine is based on are not the dominant strains for this year's flu season. I took flu vaccines a couple of times, missed an injection, and got really sick from it. So I'm not taking flu vaccines. So I'm not here someone advocating just taking as many vaccines as possible, but educate yourself on these pandemic vaccines and then make an informed decision. And if there's an informed reason not to do it, God bless, I understand that. But this kind of babble where people just throw stuff out there and privacy and Patriot Act and GPS chips and whatever crazy stuff, it's very hard to discuss with it. I'm not trying to be condescending to anyone. There is definitely room for real debate. How often should we do it? How long do the antibody last? Are there side effects to it? Do we know all the side effects yet? Fair enough. There's a robust debate. Even just going to understand what the two mRNA vaccines are. There's, for example, shingles, right? Something that debilitates people. For years, shingles is very debilitating for people, more and more so. For years, it was just a live vaccine, which had horrible side effects. Now there's a vaccine called Shingrix, which is not a side effect. It's a no-brainer. Educate yourself. That's all I can say is, I don't mean educate in an elitist kind of way. This is not about East Coast, West Coast, red or blue America. It's just the more we know, the better. And if you then make a decision for yourself or your family, your children, your parents, that based on what you know, you don't want to do something, no problem. God bless. But at least let's inform ourselves to have this discussion.
So obviously Libya's having a presidential election. We go back to the Obama administration. For the people that are listening, I'm sure they knew with the Hillary Clinton and Gaddafi, and she made her little speech and I think that was a big issue in the 2016 election for her. And, going into Libya, getting rid of Gaddafi, whether people think he was a good guy or a bad guy, they had a pretty productive economy. You can cut me off if I'm wrong on this, Daniel, but my thing is now there's slave trading in Libya, and the place is on the verge of a civil war if it's not already there. So, what is your opinion on Libya with the presidential election coming up within this week? And also, do you believe it's already a civil war there?
So the presidential election is supposed to happen on the 24th. Gaddafi was killed 10 years ago exactly, right? Part of in 2011. Now, look, I knew Gaddafi. I met him several times. I know several members of his family, and our foundation is working with young Libyans actually to create an alternative to the current thing. I think this election is actually not going to happen. Because they haven't agreed on the rules for the election yet. The people are running is, on the one hand, people like Saif al-Islam, Gaddafi's son Saif, who is actually being prosecuted at the International Criminal Court in The Hague for crimes against humanity. And then you have Khalifa Haftar, the warlord, who was a CIA asset for many years. He's in the East. Everyone basically is running for president, either crazy corrupt, like the current prime minister, Dabiba, who's running for president, who swore he wouldn't run, is running, or is a war criminal. So it's slim pickings, right? Here's the issue. First of all, okay, you don't have to like Gaddafi, but we did the same mistake we did with Saddam, which is you get rid of Saddam and you don't plan for the day after. You did the same damn mistake again in Libya. And yeah, I blame that entirely in the Obama administration that followed the French lead. You want to talk about why that war actually happened? That had to do with Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, not wanting to pay back money that he received from Gaddafi to run his campaign, and instead took out Gaddafi. That's a story. Yeah, his money guy, Bashir Salah Bashir, I talk about that in one of the footnotes of my book, Proof of Life. So there's another reason for your audience to buy that book. You can read about that, okay? Now, I think this election, if it's going to happen, it's going to be contested. It's probably not going to happen. The candidates are weak. Our foundation's working with candidates that are real candidates who are not just trying to run for president, but people who are actually developing expertise, trying to be judges, trying to be economists, trying to be teachers, trying to be healthcare. Not everyone needs to be president. We actually need to have a functioning state. You need to have other functions in there, right? So that's the teams that's what our foundation is working with, also with people on the US side, on government side too, trying to support those people. And we're training them and working with them and trying to select the right people. What you're reading about the election is such an unmitigated disaster the last 10 years. You take out Gaddafi, and then you just allow the civil war to open up. You have Africans from sub-Saharan Africa migrating through Libya, trying to make their way to Europe, being captured there, and then being sold as slaves, like you mentioned earlier. Just such an unmitigated disaster. Libya is we keep making the same mistake and expecting a different outcome. That's exactly what Einstein was definition of insanity, right? And so, yeah, that is egg on the face of the Obama administration. This is not about Benghazi and the Hillary Clintons and the death of Ambassador Stevens. It's not about that. This is about the fact that once again, U.S. takes out someone and doesn't worry about what happens about the day after and the day after the day after. So yet again, the same mistake, and a civil war in a country that would be easy to pacify. You know, Libya is a huge territory, has oil. You know how many people? 7 million people. That's nothing. Wow. You could easily have reorganized this country. I've been working there since 2012. Working with people on the ground from different parts of civil society in the country, trying to get young groups ready for leadership positions, but not about the presidency, for real leadership position to actually run that country. So, but I don't think this election is going to happen on the 24th. And if anything does happen, whoever is going to emerge from that is not going to be accepted by over half the country. So I don't see peace anytime soon, unfortunately, there.
All right. Last question before we get into that audience question on Afghanistan. Obviously, we heard throughout the summer of what happened with the, getting out of Afghanistan in plain English with the Biden administration. I was for that, as I would have been if Trump did it in general. I think we needed to get out of there. It was, a huge waste of money from start to finish. Nothing got solved. Now, there's a lot of talk of ISIS-K actually really building up over there, and fighting with the Taliban. What is the story in Afghanistan? Can you give the audience a better look of Afghanistan right now?
Oh God, that's so tragic, the story of Afghanistan. First of all, this goes back to 9/11, right? So
Yeah,
obviously 9/11, we get attacked, we have this trauma. And again, think about this for a moment, right? We have every day 9/11s happening in terms of the deaths in this country, and we can't unite about pandemic response. But we went and occupied a country for 20 years because Osama bin Laden hides there. In the end, he gets killed in Pakistan, cooperation with the Pakistani intelligence authorities, despite what you hear publicly. The Obama administration would not have been able to do that had there not been a cooperation. So a lot of what you heard about the SEALs and you read about it was a lot of it was done in cooperation, not in the dark. So that's the story for another day. Now, because he's hiding out in Afghanistan, we go into Afghanistan. You know, if you can't learn from the mistakes of others, like the Soviets in Afghanistan, you're going to be condemned to suffer the same fate, right? Afghanistan became to us exactly what it was to the Soviet troops, right? This unmitigated disaster. Now, think about the arrogance. You go to Afghanistan and you're going to tell them, hey, we're going to help you build a new national army. Now, you know what? There's one thing the Afghans don't need help in is how to fight. They know that pretty well, just like people in Yemen. You know what they could have used? Let's rethink our system. We're a tribal country. We're a huge territory. We need to decentralize. We need to have autonomies, local autonomies, break up the country to some extent so that what happens in one province doesn't destroy the other province. Isolate these tribal fiefdoms, create political systems, sometimes even religious systems, a mixed religious and secular law. Let's have family law be governed by Sharia law in some places where that's the only way to accept it. Let's have tribal courts. That's real work. But to do that, you need our development agency, AID, the Agency for International Development, to actually think through intelligent development. You look at those funds, let alone the human lives that have been lost, but the funds that have been thrown down that pit for what?
nothing.
So to me, if you're going to go in there, and that's not the moment now to debate that, if you're going to go in there, can we please do intelligent development? What are we doing there? What are we doing? Trying to copy what? The US political system? Can we start to have decentralized political systems that can be viable in their own pockets so you don't get back to having the Taliban now exactly to where they were 20 years ago?
It's terrible. So I wanted to talk about that, Saudi-Yemen war right now and how the U.S. is feeding all these weapons to the Saudis to fight in Yemen, which is a total disaster. We see people like Bernie Sanders, allies with people like Rand Paul, who they don't like each other, standing up against this and saying that this is just money going down the drain as it was in Afghanistan. We were feeding all this. And, we've went through this in the last interview, and I don't expect to go through this again with what the Saudis and the jihadist teachings against Israel, against the United States. 17 out of the 19 hijackers coming from Saudi Arabia to blow up the Pentagon and the World Trade Center, along with that field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. So why are we doing this when Biden apparently, and this is what the story was apparently because of the gas prices going up, was because Biden wouldn't meet with the Saudis and they were pissed off about it. And he didn't go like Obama did and Trump did and everybody before and bow down to the Saudis that they were not going to release a lot of this oil. So, it seems like the administration plays one way with the Saudis with, the oil stuff as what they did. And Biden doesn't want to meet with the Saudis because of Khashoggi. I don't know. But then they're still giving them the money to kill innocent Yemenis.
They're not giving the money, they're giving them the weapons. They're allowing them to buy the weapons. Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's our schizophrenic foreign policy. The only consistent foreign policy that we've had is the military industrial complex, right? In other words, that what really determines our foreign policy is that we need to sell weapon system at all costs. And so when it comes to, we talk, this is my point with China, the same thing. Can we stop this hypocritical talk about human rights violations when we're willing to sell weapons to, cluster bombs that go to the Saudis, which then kill children in Yemen? What's the point of that? Now, not only is it wrong, morally wrong, but when it comes to the Saudis, it's particularly stupid. And I'll tell you why. And I'm going to sort of overgeneralize it just for the sake of keeping this conversation short. Basically, for 100 years, we've had a policy with Saudi Arabia that we buy their oil, we provide them protection, And they agreed to price every oil deal in US dollars, and that's how the US dollar becomes a global reserve currency. That worked for a long time. Now, a number of things have changed since then. Most importantly, that we actually, in the US, could be the world's largest oil producer and exporter if we wanted to, because we have that ability now with fracking and shale to actually do that. Yes, it's more expensive oil than Saudi oil. It may cost $50 a barrel rather than $6 a barrel for Saudi light crude, but nevertheless, we have that. We no longer need to have this pact with the Saudis on oil. We no longer need to beg them on our knees to please release more oil so that the oil prices here don't skyrocket, right? We don't need to do that. And so if you do not like Saudi policy, if you don't like the new crown prince, whether it's what he did to Khashoggi, which is, in my opinion, not a reason to base foreign policy on it, right? It's as awful as that may be. But for whatever other reason, you don't like the jihadist teachings coming out of the Wahhabi clerics there, whatever it is, you don't need to have the Saudis be your primary ally. And even if they are your ally and you have relationships, you can say, look, man, here's how we're going to do this. We're going to have this oil policy. We're going to have these weapons policies. These are conditions. These weapons aren't to be used in Yemen. You use them in Yemen, our relationship changes entirely. If they then say, well, then we'll just go to China and we'll get it all from there, you have to be willing to say, good luck. Live with China. There are consequences to that. Now, if you say we have to keep China out of Saudi Arabia at all costs, then you go. Then you have to find that relationship. And that may mean that your weapons get used in Yemen. So these things are interconnected. It's not now for me to just give you an answer, say it's right or it's wrong. It's easy to say it's wrong when children get killed in Yemen. That's true. But you have to understand the bigger picture. And the problem with us, we never have a coherent policy. It's okay, you can scream about Khashoggi and I'm never going to sit down with this guy, and then you turn around and give him weapons. Exactly. You sound like a fool. You sound like a fool. Right? In other words, stop screaming, stop the grandstanding, stop talking about human rights. That's the first thing. Stop talking. If you care about human rights, do. Protect them. Grant asylum to people who are persecuted, right? There are ways to help. I'm all for that. Absolutely. Do not turn your back on people in need. Absolutely. But that's not a foreign policy. That's a humanitarian policy. When you talk about foreign policy, what actually are the U.S. national interests? You talk about Saudi Arabia. What's our national interest? Is it oil? Is it the strategic, where it's geostrategically located? Is it China? Is it keeping China out of there? Is it keeping Russian weapon system out of there? What are our interests? Define them and then execute it.
Daniel Levin, again, the book is Proof of Life. If you want to find more about Daniel, it's DanielLevinAuthor.com. Again, DanielLevinAuthor.com. Daniel, it's always a pleasure. Love having you on.
Thanks,
love
Rob.
Always the insight.
Thanks, Rob. Pleasure's all mine.